Good morning. Welcome to St. Mary's in Rollinsford, New Hampshire. I'm Elizabeth Farish, a board member on the Piscataqua Decorative Arts Society board, and I'm joined by my fellow board member, Peter Michaud, architectural historian, who grew up in this church, and he's going to give us a tour. Welcome.
So as part of the holiday season, we thought to provide some digital programming, since we can't meet live still yet. We tour several area churches during this season and see some of them will be decorated, some of them won't, and have people talking about their history. And we thought we'd begin here at St. Mary's, which St. Mary's is considered to be the oldest continuously active church in the state of New Hampshire. There are two buildings that are older. One is still a church, but only used seasonally on Claremont, New Hampshire, and the other one, which was St. Anne's in Manchester, is now part of the New Hampshire Institute of Art. St. Mary's, which was built in 1857, has been open since that time and has had masses on a regular basis, and thus has that distinction of oldest continuously active church. It is also the oldest church, Catholic church I should say, in the Piscataqua region. The church was built, as I said, in 1857 by Irish immigrants who came to work at the Salmon Falls Manufacturing Company, which is just outside the front doors of the church. And it was a bit of a battle. It was a really difficult time for Irish Catholics. There was a lot of Irish and anti-Irish sentiment during this time. The Know Nothing Party had a tick in popularity. The Know Nothings were an anti-immigrant, pro-labor party that did not want to see the Irish establish a foothold in America, were very anti-Catholic. And in fact, here in Rollinsford, the 2 years before the church was constructed, Rollinsford actually elected a know-nothing town moderator. So that know-nothing sentiment was definitely here in this town. But in spite of that, in the early 1850s, Catholics had their first mass in a large boarding house, which sat right next door to where the church is, a building that was locally known as the Irish Tavern. And in 1857, organized themselves and began construction of this church. And what's interesting is the church history, which has been written several times in the 20th century, relies heavily on a 1920s history that we now know has a lot of errors. And I think the biggest error is that it claims, without a doubt, that the church was designed by Boston architect Patrick Ford. When we did some history and research recently, we discovered that Patrick Ford was indeed an architect in Boston and did a lot of Catholic churches, but in 1857 was 10 years old and living in Ireland. So it's really unlikely that Patrick Ford designed the church, unless if he had some type of correspondence architectural design firm going on, but the age of 10, that's doubtful.
Genius children.
Genius children. What we think is another Patrick designed this church, Patrick Keeley, who immigrated from Ireland and by the 1840s had established himself as a designer of churches. We believe designed this church, and there are several reasons for that. This church on the exterior is very similar to a church that he designed in Biddeford, New Hampshire, which is no longer extant. And while the interior of this church, the truss work, we don't see in any other real, we'll show that in a moment. It doesn't really appear in other Patrick Keeley buildings. This church had a near twin in Holy Trinity Church, which was built up in Somersworth just 2 years later. And the interior of Holy Trinity is very similar to other Patrick Keeley churches. So we feel fairly strongly, or fairly confident, that this is another Keeley designed church. It would not be out of the ordinary. And it's a church that has seen a lot of design changes. The church was finished in 1861, or 1859, excuse me, but it wasn't decorated until the 1870s. And the first major decoration of the church occurred in 1870s, and then there were three others. There was another major decoration of the building in 1892, in 1907. I'm sorry, there were several more, 1940s, and then again in the 1970s. And we'll talk a little bit about that. There's remnants of each of them. And I want to begin by looking at this piece here. This is a lithograph of the interior of the church as appeared in circa 1880. You can see, we'll see once again those truss work, which is a standard king post truss with decorative elements, the center niche. What's interesting is this captures what the church looked like when it was soon after it was constructed and after that decorative campaign. There was an oral history that this church was built with box pews. This lithograph confirms it. You can see the box pews below. You can also see there have been some changes as well. We know that flanking the altar, there are two big windows, and those were put in 1907. Before that, we had three small windows, and because this is so detailed, we know which windows were where. So the window of Mary with the infant Jesus, which is above the altar, is still there today. There's a window to the left of a dove in a triangle and a circle interlocked, which represents the Holy Spirit and the Holy Trinity. And that was moved up here. If you look over here, you can see that was where up here, in this above the altar, was moved over here.
Wow.
And then this window over here, this other circle window, had the letters above Jesus' cross, and that was removed and then set over the front door of the church facing out. So it's behind us over here. The other interesting thing is the choir rail. If you look, the communion rail used to bow out in front of the side altars of Mary and Joseph. That was later changed to a straight shot.
Are these recessed?
Nope,
That's just paint.
That's just paint. That's a trompe-l'oeil effect.
Sure.
So let's go into the body of the church and we'll point out some of the other details. So what we don't know, or what we know is, and it may not show up on the video, but if you look, the walls of the church are rusticated. They're scored to look like granite blocks, and that is original to the construction of the church. And then these amazing trusses, which I love. They're basically, if you look, I'll point out, it's a king post truss. You have your vertical member here and the king post rising up there. The struts have been bent to make 1/2 of an arch. And then you have, mostly decorative, these other struts that come down. So you have two Gothic arches and then circles that infill in the corners. And then the bolsters below, which allow the truss to sort of meet the wall, also have that same circle motif. And so you get this wonderful sort of play of geometry going along here. But then overall, if you look, you can see this was one giant trefoil arch. So you have the curve up, so for the side of the trefoil, the top of the trefoil comes up and down, and then the other side of the trefoil here. When this church was originally constructed, or originally decorated, I should say, the decoration occurred at the same time as the stained glass windows. And if you look at the stained glass windows, we have two figural windows. One is of St. Michael, which is in honor of the parish priest who founded the church. He had recently died, and the parishioners paid for the figure of St. Michael. The other one is in memory, or is a gift of William Bingham, who was one of the parishioners who was mainly responsible for organizing the construction. And for him, they chose aptly St. Peter. But then the rest of these windows have Catholic iconography or Christian iconography, like the Sacred Heart of Jesus over here, the Lamb holding a flag. Over here we have a monstrance, which holds would be used for the display and adoration of the Holy Communion. The sword and the crown. And when we look at that lithograph that we had earlier, you can see the ceiling that these were coordinated. That the ceiling had originally painted decoration, and every other square, basically, or every other rectangle had an icon in the center that. Some of which corresponded to what we see in the stained glass windows. And what's really interesting is you can see where we have this sort of strapping now that sits here. I would be interested to see if they ever need to do work on the ceiling, if these are panels that were put up, and because these strappings would cover the seams, and what might exist underneath. Was that painting covered up, or was it painted over? But the strapping doesn't appear in the lithograph, but it's definitely something that appears to be added, and it'd be interesting to know what's underneath.
Peter, the stained glass windows, is it religiously significant or decoration that there's no light entering this room other than passing through stained glass? There's no plain glass.
It's mostly decoration. There's not really a significance to it. In fact, what happened, this church was probably very dark when it was first built because they actually added windows. As I mentioned, in 1907, they added the two big windows flanking the altar, which that faces west, so in the afternoon it lets more light in. But then also, come down this way, and this is a perfect time to view this, although it may not come out clearly on video. If you look, there are two stained glass windows flanking the organ. There were no windows there originally. Those were also added in 1907. Here we are in the morning, that faces east, and it allows a lot of light. And they aren't very dark stained glass, so I think it was an intentional choice to allow more morning light into the religious space.
It worked.
So other changes that occurred in here. So the box pews left in 1892. In 1892, they totally removed everything. They removed the wainscot, they removed the pews, they removed the floorboards, they removed the floor support system, and put a whole new floor in. They put these new pews in at that point in time. These are from 1892. The beadboard wainscot also went in at that same time. And also, they electrified and heated the church so that they dug out a basement on that side of the church to put in a coal-fired furnace. And then they replaced, there used to be oil lights that hung in the center of each truss, and those were replaced with electrical lights that then these replaced about 10, 15 years later. We're not quite sure when these came in, but at any time between 1907 and 1920.
What about the plaques on the wall underneath the crosses?
So these are the Stations of the Cross, which are serve a religious purpose, and they tell the story. They actually begin over here and tell the story of the trial and crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. And these were, we think, also added as part of that 1907 renovation of the church. And if we get up close, these were also, you can see, modified originally. They originally were polychromatic. And you can see up here, you can see where there was originally an arch, and the little cross used to sit on top of the arch.
I see.
So in the 1970s, this church was redecorated yet again. And it was a response to ecumenical changes that occurred as part of the Vatican II Council of the 1960s. A way to try to freshen up and open the church, and several changes were made. Originally, these walls would have been stenciled, as I mentioned. The ceilings were painted. There were two generations of that stenciling and painting, the first one in the 1870s, the second one in 1907. Those get painted over, and everything at one point in the 70s becomes this buff color. The Stations of the Cross, which were plastered directly onto the walls, were removed, conserved, but then modified to what you see today. The trusses, and this is a great place to point this out, the choir rail in the organ case, and the organ case we know also dates to the 1870s, are both faux grain finished, and these trusses were also faux grain finished. In order to lighten up the church, the decision was made to paint the trusses as well, and the trusses were also a warm buff color originally. And then the altar furniture that you see is sort of a mix, but the altar of Mary and the altar of Joseph and the cross in the back originally had blue mosaic tiles and much more modern sculpture in front of them, and were very, very 70s as well.
And of course, the creche is set for Christmas.
Yep, and if you look, the creche is set for Christmas. The creche was actually, the walls of the creche were constructed by Father Andrew, who is the current parish priest.
Wow.
Which is a beautiful job. And he did this a couple years ago, and it comes back every year, and it looks fantastic.
It does, it's impressive.
And the Catholic Church, of course, doesn't stop Christmas on Christmas Day. Christmas goes until January 6th in the Epiphany. So if you look in front of the altar, the wise men are slowly making their way through the creche.
Oh, I haven't quite made it yet. And so have church services continued during the COVID-19 pandemic?
When church services were allowed by the governor, church services did reopen, but you can see The pews have been marked off to make sure
Yes.
social distancing is maintained.
Yes.
A few sort of odds and ends. The altarpiece that you see back here is not original to the church. That was brought in sometime in, I believe, the early 2000s, but has no historical associations here. The pipe organ is an interesting story. The original pipe organ was designed by was constructed by the George H. Ryder Company out of Boston, Massachusetts. And we just recently discovered this, and I'm sad we didn't know this when the organ was refurbished several years ago and was completely emptied out, because he supposedly was known for drawing cat graffiti in his organ cases. And I would love to explore the interior to see if there's any cat graffiti in there. Unfortunately, the manual organ that he built was removed. The case was maintained, but the organ and the console were removed in the late 50s, early 60s, when the church contracted with the Kershaw Organ Company out of Lowell, Mass. And so what we have now is a Ryder case, and I believe Ryder organ display pipes in the front, but the interior is all 1950s, early 60s pipes from the Kershaw Organ Company. It still sounds nice, but it's not technically the original organ that the church bought back in the 1870s.
Are there any plans for future changes?
Not that I know of. They've been really good at doing, this is a great plea for, this is a church that's been really good at doing routine maintenance. They've, as part of that 1970s rehab of the interior, they also did an inspection of the exterior and repointed brickwork at that time. They've made sure to paint woodwork on a regular basis. They did have an issue in the late 1990s where they had a sill starting to rot on the steeple outside on the spire. And they also had some brickwork that started to bow from moisture infiltration on the back wall here. Both of those things were taken care of. The steeple was completely repainted and was just again repainted this year. So, when you see so many churches struggling and having major issues, and we've seen some churches like the one in Dover, St. Charles, get demolished because small problems became too large. The routine maintenance that has been done here has really helped to make sure that projects stay affordable and that the church can continue to work and survive into the 21st century.
Because there's still an active congregation.
Yes.
Unlike other Catholic communities.
Yes, an active congregation, and then I think you'd be remiss to not mention the St. Anne's Guild, which has been around since 1919. They just celebrated their 100th anniversary. They're the oldest social organization in the town.
Wow.
And they do a church fair every year, and in 6 hours raise anywhere between $12,000 to $15,000, and often help out with projects here at the church.
They should consult with some of our local nonprofits.
They really should consult it. Whenever you see a church say, we can't do it, I'm like, look at them.
Yeah, yes you can.
Yes, you can.
Speaking of St. Anne, when we were talking earlier, you mentioned that this might be one of the original statues?
No, not original. So after the rehab in 1892, this statue appears in a photograph of the church. So we know that she came sometime after 1892, but before 1898. So she's well over 100 years old. And as Monica pointed out, you can tell there's a little tag. She was refurbished in the 1940s. And she needs a little help again. Her finger's broken.
She needs her finger glued back on. She's lovely.
She needs some plaster work.
Who doesn't?
So if you want, you can take a look real quickly. The one place that most people don't get to see in a church is the sacristy, and we can take a quick look in that. Follow me. And of course, this beautiful piece of furniture, and unfortunately I don't know its age, but is purposely built to store the materials that are needed by a priest for saying masses and other things. So that you have this back here, and this is a room where the priest would get ready and prepare and dress in his robes to then go out and say mass to the congregation. And it still serves the purpose that it was originally built for.
It's amazing. And still the same light fixture.
Same light fixture, and then the windows here as well are from 1907.
Beautiful.
So thank you very much for coming, and we'll be posting throughout the week. We'll be posting it into next weekend. Different churches that will be not just Catholic. We have some Unitarian churches, Congregational churches, an Episcopal church. So keep an eye on our Facebook page, and we'll be hopefully seeing you virtually soon. Thank you for coming.
See you.